Kennedy gets all, this is from Dave Olson. Hi, Dave. Kennedy gets all the credit for the space program, but it was Ike who got it going in the first place. And I recently watched a program which claimed that he deliberately let the USSR launch Sputnik before our first satellite, which was Explorer or Vanguard. I actually don't remember. I want to say it was Explorer 1, I think. Thereby setting the precedent that any country can overfly any other country in space. Thoughts? Yeah, anytime I hear that the president had the power to do something like stop the Pearl Harbor attack or something like this, I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. I don't buy the idea of Eisenhower saying, yeah, well, we could go launch a satellite, but we'll let the Russians do it first. Although, you know, it was pretty much exclusively Eisenhower who decided that it wasn't worth the Americans taking Berlin or any of the other Eastern European capitals. The Red Army fought, you know, they did 70% of the fighting against the Nazis, but Patton and the Third Army were moving so fast, and we easily could have beaten them to Berlin and probably to Prague as well, and that would have saved those countries, you know, 50, 60 years or whatever it was of communism. And Ike was the one who said, no, this one belongs to the Russians. So if there was ever anybody who might have let that happen, I suppose it's him, but no, I don't believe it. I don't think that ever happened. Let me talk about something that is actually kind of profound and interesting as a result of some of this research I've been doing. If you've been a fan of the show for a while, you know that when I run into moon landing conspiracy people, I just go ballistic. And I have had so much contempt for people that don't believe it, and especially for young people who are sure that it couldn't have happened because, you know, they didn't have as good computers. The graphics weren't as good as the ones I've got on my video card, and it just didn't happen. I had nothing but real, genuine animosity and some actual rage towards people who promoted this idea that it never happened. And it's everywhere, and it's getting stronger and stronger and stronger all the time. Eric Blake mentioned when that Buzz Aldrin was confronted with the moon landing being fake, and he punched out a reporter. And I remember that very well. Everybody remembers that well. But when the guy confronted Buzz back then, was it 30 years ago now or something, and said, admit that it never happened, people would look at this clip and say, so is this the only guy in the world who believes we didn't land on the moon? I mean, what's the matter with this guy? Now it's becoming more mainstream every day. But I have come to realize why so many people, more people every day, do not believe that the moon landing happened. As we get further and further away from it, fewer and fewer people believe in it. And I didn't understand why. They'll say it's the computers or the video technology or whatever, but they're determined that it hadn't happened. And I couldn't understand why. And then suddenly I did. They believed the moon landing didn't happen. Stay with me on this. Because if you just take the moon landing and just parachute it into society like a YouTube clip, then it is a miracle. It's impossible. If you think about, okay, so there was, all of a sudden we wake up one day in the 60s and we've landed on the moon. If that's your attitude towards it, it seems like such an enormous leap, so much of a miracle that it just couldn't possibly be true. And this is my big breakthrough thought on this. It's given me a great deal of patience that I didn't have before. The reason that people don't believe in the moon landing was because you kind of had to be there. And what I mean by that is, young people think that basically what happened was Americans came home, turned on their TV, saw the picture of the moon landing, which was easily faked in a studio according to them, and all of the people bought into this thing when obviously just simply was too difficult, couldn't happen. But the thing I've realized is that since they weren't there, they don't realize, number one, just how focused the entire society was on space and space toys and space interests and space shows and space movies. But much more importantly, whenever you hear guys talking about moon landing conspiracies, the one thing you never hear them talk about is what came before the moon landing. Because they want to make it sound like it just appeared. How is that possible? But one of the things that I've been working on is you can, and I'll do it for you, you can go from a bottle rocket out in your backyard, which presumably you would agree is not the result of a conspiracy. You believe that bottle rockets will fly. You can go from bottle rockets to the moon. And if you look at it as bottle rockets to the moon, then the moon landing seems impossible. But there were so many incremental steps that no one can say at which point it became a miracle. There was, I'm going to lay out some of this for you. You tell me at which point you want to insert the conspiracy card. And this is the thing that nobody gets. So, do you believe in bottle rockets? Yes. Okay, so far so good. Robert Goddard built a liquid-fueled rocket, which had the ability to be throttled up and down. It looked like it was a combination of a rocket and a backyard swing. It looked like a flying bird cage, the most ungainly and silly-looking thing ever. But it was a liquid-fueled rocket, and it did fly. Didn't go very high, but do you believe that? Okay, yes, good. Okay. Do you believe that Werner von Braun and a number of other German hobbyists basically were fascinated with this and basically built rockets in a rocket club, and then Hitler decided to put some money into that along with all the other social programs that he was doing, and then when he realized it might be a weapon, put a lot of money into it. Werner von Braun wanted to fly men in space, so I guess he just decided he's going to take whoever's writing the check. But they launched 1,000, I guess, maybe that many, something like that, 1,000 V2 rockets against England. And, you know, they didn't go into orbit, but they went up real high, and then they came down and landed in London. Do you believe that that happened? And I haven't heard anybody saying that the V2 is a fraud. There's a lot of rocket explosions there. Lots and lots of neighborhoods got cratered. Lots and lots of video of them taking off. Okay, so far so good. 1957 comes along. It's the International Geophysical Year, which was a really kind of a cool thing, a year of everybody trying to cooperate, all these countries scientifically cooperating with each other, IGY. And as part of IGY, they cut the warhead off of a V2, and they added a smaller rocket to the top called the WAC Corporal, named after, you know, the WACs were the Women's Air Corps. And so it was basically the Lady Corporal. And they put this smaller rocket on top of the V2. Then they launched the V2, and when the V2 was just running out of fuel and running out of energy, and it was starting to slow down, when they'd gotten everything they could get out of the V2, they ignited the WAC Corporal, and this thing went much, much further, because instead of starting at 0 feet, all the drag, no acceleration, the thing begins its journey at, maybe, I don't know, 80,000 feet, 100,000 feet in the air, and it's moving very fast. So the WAC Corporal did really well. So anybody have a problem with that? Because that's a staged rocket. No? Okay, so far so good. So from the WAC Corporal, we go to the Redstone booster, which if you were to see a Redstone, you would be astonished at how small it is. It really is just unbelievable to walk up. You don't get the sense from an Atlas quite so much. But the Redstone looks like a telephone pole, honestly. And it was the first, or one of the first, intercontinental ballistic missiles we had. And so the Mercury capsule is essentially just a piece of tin with a hatch on it. Do you believe that it's possible to put that capsule on top of that rocket and have it be so weak that it doesn't actually get you into orbit? It just takes you up into space and back down again. Yeah, okay. All right, so that's real. Then we add the Atlas to Mercury, from Mercury Redstone to Mercury Atlas. Now we got a much bigger missile, much more powerful. It'll enable you to not only go straight up and down into space, but to go fast enough to get into orbit. Do you believe that John Glenn orbited the Earth in Friendship 7? Yeah. Okay, so now we've got a man in orbit around the Earth in a little capsule. What about if we use 2 men? Would you buy that? Okay. What if during this mission, with the two men, one of the men were to get out and fly free of the ship and do a spacewalk? Would you buy that? Yeah. Would you believe that they could launch these two-man ships two at a time and meet each other in orbit so that they're looking in each other's windows and waving at each other? Yeah, if you've launched a Mercury program capsule and a Gemini program capsule, and it doesn't seem too hard to believe. Okay, so you can believe in the rendezvous. What about if we had them try it again? Instead of rendezvousing with another capsule, they rendezvoused with a docking target, a Gina upper stage. Would you buy that? Yeah, well, it's not a big jump from the previous thing. And you can see where I'm going with this. And then you say, okay, so that required the Gemini program, required the Titan missile, which is a much bigger missile. What about the flight of the unmanned flights of the Apollo on the Saturn 1 and Saturn 1B? They're just knocking the caps up into space to see if it would hold. Because if you believe in the last step, you got to believe in that one. There's no magical jump between the two. And then you've got the Saturn 1B, and then you launch Apollo 7. So you've taken, on Apollo 7, you're taking the you're taking the command module and the service module into Earth orbit. Anybody have a problem with that? No, because it's no different than really putting John Glenn into orbit. Okay. So Apollo 7 puts the service module, command module in orbit. We know we can get it into orbit. We know that the third stage will get it into orbit. And we know that the command module and the service module will perform as advertised. Okay? So next time we launch another Saturn V for Apollo 8. This time we take, actually kind of interesting. Did we take I don't think we did. Did we take a LEM on Apollo 8? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that we did, but I'm not sure. In any event, we've just tested out the command module and service module. That's working great, so kept it up in space for several days. Now we're going to go around the moon. We're not going to detach, no LEM, thank you. We're just going to take this thing that we've already tried and worked in Earth orbit, and instead of keeping it in Earth orbit, we're going to send it around the moon. The amount of energy needed to get it to the moon and back, I think, is something like 2% of the total energy that was needed to get it into orbit in the first place. So obviously the hard work is getting it into Earth orbit. It takes a little bit of a push to get it to go around the moon. So there's nothing there that's a big leap from the previous mission, Apollo 7. So that's Apollo 8. Now you've got Apollo 9, but you're not landing on the moon with Apollo 9. You're not even going to the moon. We went to the moon on Apollo 8 and Apollo 9. We decided, okay, now that we have a LEM that's ready, what we're going to do is we're going to take Apollo 9 and we're going to go into Earth orbit, which we've done many times, and we're going to practice getting the command service module off, turning around, getting rid of the fairing, docking with the LEM, pulling the LEM out from the third stage, and then we fly around up in Earth orbit with the command module and the LEM for a while. Is that a big leap from the previous step? No. Very good. So that's 9. Okay, Apollo 10. Now, Apollo 10, we're going to do what we did with Apollo 8. Remember that one just a little while ago? We're going to go back to the moon, but this time we're going to take the LEM with us, and we can do that because we tried the LEM in Earth orbit. So if it worked in Earth orbit, and if we went to the moon without the LEM, with just the command service module, then this should work, right? Okay, so they take Apollo 10 to the moon. They separate the LEM. John Young has probably got the I would imagine the toughest mission of all time. He's in a lunar module. He's in orbit around the moon. He departs the command service module, and he takes the lunar module down to, I want to say it was about 47,000 feet, something like that. So we don't land, but we do everything except for land, pretty much everything except for land. We slow ourselves down with the descent stage, and then at a certain altitude, then we just kick off the descent stage, and then we come back up with the ascent stage. So that's all working. So when we get to Apollo 11, where did the conspiracy begin? If you believe in bottle rockets, and there's nothing between the moon landing and bottle rockets that is a miraculous leap, the step from moon rocket from bottle rocket to moon rocket is a miraculous leap. But the step from bottle rocket to V2, from V2 to Whack Corporal, from Whack Corporal to Mercury Redstone, to Mercury Atlas, to Gemini Titan, to Apollo 7, 8, 9, 10, it's all just simple incremental steps. And that's when I realized why so many people don't believe in the moon landing. It's because they weren't there for all of this preparation and planning and expectation. We know coming up in 2 months we're going to go around the moon in Apollo 8 if everything goes well. So they're never given the steps needed to get to Apollo 11. And so then you just have to ask yourself, like I said, where do you insert the conspiracy card? I'm going to have to go to bed. I'm going to have to go home early tonight. Where do you put it in? I suppose if you had to pick one place, I would imagine you'd probably put it between Apollo 7 and Apollo 8. Because if you're going around the moon and, But that's what's missing. That's what's missing from people who believe that it didn't happen. They're missing how incremental it was over the course of 10 years, and they also miss how obsessed we were with being astronauts and space flight and all the rest. The only thing they could probably connect that to is that in Toy Story, the original Toy Story, it's about a toy named Woody who's a cowboy toy, who's upstaged by a much, much cooler space toy. And that's exactly what happened to American culture and American kids. We all just went from wanting to be cowboys to wanting to be astronauts. Yeah, and then Eric says they talk about the Van Allen belts being, impenetrable and stuff. You're in spacesuits, you're in a shielded ship. If there had been a solar flare, they would have been in real trouble. So they go through the Van Allen belts. They didn't park there, and they're not like the belts on Jupiter. So I think if I remember correctly, when the guys came back, they had something like 3 times the radiation level that they would get in a normal year. But this is just a simple, culture-wide misunderstanding of radiation and what radiation can and cannot do. There is no question. Somebody out here might know the answer to this, but as far as I can see, there is no question that yours truly has been far more irradiated than any of the Apollo astronauts, because I had one of those radioactive tracer dye heart tests back in 2011. I mean, I was Spider-Man for a couple days there. They gave me a little card because if I went to an airport, all of the radiation detectors would go off. They went off in the hospital. I was coming out of the cafeteria. They gave me the injection. They have to wait for it to spread, and they do you resting, and then they get your heart rate up and do you at a higher heartbeat rate, and then they can use an algorithm to determine how much of this chemical has been pushed out into your tissues. If your heart is strong, then a lot of it has, and if your heart is weak, then not so much. So I'm in the cafeteria, and the person who gave me the shot, the orderly, comes and finds me, and I said, "You ready to go?" He said, "Yes." So I got up and started walking, and he said, slow down, just slow down for a second. I'm right in front of the candy machines." I thought, okay, so does this guy want me to buy some candy? But the next thing I know, he goes, whoop, 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 whoop. I see these police officers running down the hall, and the guy's going, "Oh, it's okay, I've got him here." I set off the radiation detectors because I was radioactive. And radioactive is not fatal, and radiation is not fatal. Radiation can be fatal, but it's not. And this is something that so many people have a big misunderstanding about. The 2 things I like to talk about with radiation, Eric, and people say they could never have survived the Van Allen belts. Well, yes, they can. They took more radiation than they would have if they hadn't gone, but there was nothing close to a fatal level of radiation. And the 2 things that I remember most about radiation, One of them was from Stephen Denbest back at USS Clueless, who I miss very much. Really brilliant guy. And we were talking about, there's three examples. We're talking about depleted uranium in Iraq. The Iraq war either just started or was just about to start, and people were saying that the bullets that they used on the A-10 are depleted uranium. And the reason they go with depleted uranium is because it's heavier than lead. And if you're going to shoot at something and try and destroy it with a bullet, the heavier the bullet, speed being equal, the more energy it's going to take down to the target. So, depleted uranium is nice and heavy, and heavier than lead makes a good bullet if you really want to sling something. And everybody was saying that these depleted uranium bullets were going to basically irradiate the people of Iraq because all of these radioactive bullets would be around. And Steve Denbest, and the reason I believe this was because he was an engineer, he always ended up with the math to prove any of these things. Denbest said, I've done some calculations, and he said, if I were to make a statue of myself, a full-scale statue of myself, out of depleted uranium, and I put my arms around the statue and hugged it, I would be irradiating the statue. Awesome. The second most awesome one is that would you be, you can ask some of these greenies, would you be willing to go into a nuclear power plant just on a tour? Are you kidding? No. What, would you be willing to spend, half an hour in a nuclear power plant's control room? Would you be comfortable with the radiation levels there? Absolutely not. Didn't I say depleted? Did I say something other than depleted? Yes, I know it's no longer radioactive. That's why it's depleted. But my point is that the ignorance of people was that because it said uranium, they thought it's radioactive, but it's depleted uranium, and all the radioactivity's gone out of it. And that's why Denbest pointed out that this is a silly thing to be complaining about. It just shows how much you don't know about things. If you had a depleted uranium statue, you would irradiate it. The second best one is to ask people if they would be willing to take a risk of being in a control room at a nuclear reactor for half an hour. A lot of people would say no. And then you get to spring the interesting fact on them that Grand Central Station in New York City has, at any given time, has 4 times the acceptable level of radiation in a nuclear plant's control room. In other words, the background radiation level inside of Grand Central Station is 4 times higher than the highest allowable in a nuclear power plant because it's all of the granite. The granite is somewhat radioactive. People hear that and they just, yeah, it's just, it's part of life. If we weren't able to deal with the radiation, we'd all be dead. But yeah, if you've gone to work every day in Grand Central Station, you've taken far more radioactivity than a guy who spent his life working in or at least an equivalent amount of time working in a nuclear power plant. That freaks him out. But the best one by far, remember, I love when people can do the math on these things. Then I get to use them rhetorically, and I don't have to. I was told that there'd be no math involved. I remember when Fukushima happened, I think it might have been somebody up at SpaceX. And everybody's saying, oh my God, there are detectable levels of radiation coming across from Japan. And I remember the hysteria here in LA. Hysteria. People going to hospitals and asking, what can we do? And do we need to get some radioactive iodine and all of this other stuff? And it was just so ridiculous. I mean, detectable. We can still detect Pioneer 11. It's outside the solar system. But when Fukushima happened and all this hysteria was going on, somebody said that they did the math. And the way they phrased it was, do you think that for the people who live closest to Fukushima, do you think it'd be a good idea for us to send jets over, commercial jets, and evacuate them and bring them back to the United States for a while until this thing cools down? And most people immediately said, yeah, that'd be great. And then the person says, well, on that 17-hour flight from Japan to Los Angeles or Chicago, they're going to take a lot more radiation than they would have taken if they'd stayed on the ground in Fukushima, because you get irradiated when you're on an airplane. So it's not a joke. Nobody talks about it because it's pointless. The people who are at risk are the people who are at risk from radiation in our society are people who work among these elevated levels of radiation that are not harmful in a dose or many doses. But if you are a flight attendant and you spend 8 or 10 hours a day above most of the ozone layer, I don't know if it's above the ozone layer, come to think of it, but above most of the atmosphere, when you're 10% up in the atmosphere, you're above 90% of the atmosphere by density. So pilots and flight attendants have elevated risks of cancer because their radiation exposure is pretty high, because they spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day for 30 years up there. And somebody else gets it too, like dental assistants, or medical assistants. Tooth x-ray or chest x-ray is not going to hurt you. 10 of them aren't going to hurt you. But if you do 100 of them a day, every day for 50 years, that could be, get to be a problem. But people's fear of radiation is just completely unbalanced and unsubstantiated. And when you hear people say things like that, you just realize you're dealing with somebody who doesn't know much about science. I'm not aware, by the way, of any statistically greater number of deaths from cancer from the, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, so that's 9 missions. 27 people who've been through the Van Allen belts. I don't think any of them it's not like they're all showing a higher rate of cancers or anything. And Merlin points out that dental radiation is less radiation than sunlight now. It is. They've gotten really good with it. But back in the olden days, they used to turn that thing on and power would go out. You get a brownout across the street. But yeah. So anyway, I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to go.